Lord, we thank you that we could be together. We also thank you that you allow us as sinners to read your word and to know that you look upon us in different ways because we are in Christ Jesus. And we ask you that you would help us to live in such a way that we are like that. I want to ask tonight that you would help us as we read this text to read it in a way that we see it for what it is and therefore begin to start to understand that such observations are quite consistent with knowing the living God. We'd like to ask for help and bless us as we read it. Bless our questions and talk and things we exchange tonight. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, Ecclesiastes actually makes the claim to be the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So it does claim to be a work of Solomon or unmistakably someone of David's line. But towards the middle of it, you'll see he is in fact a king. So that that's something that the book itself makes that claim. Now, if you're reading a modern translation of Ecclesiastes, you'd actually see that what the old language talks about, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. You have to be fairly sure about that because, for example, if you read, as I am here, a New International Version, it would begin with the words of the teacher, not preacher, the words of the teacher, a son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Because vanity is seen as an empty thing, and the understanding of vanity, and vanity of vanities is like king of kings, lord of lords, song of songs. It's the vanity of all vanities. It's the epitome of vanities. And so when you have that expression in Hebrew, you're actually having a superlative expression. Vanity of vanities this is the most vain, empty, and therefore the word meaningless in the New International Version. And it's helpful to, I think, read a modern version because I'm reading my American Standard and I'll stay with it, but, excuse me, but but to come back to a modern one helps you sort of see, it sets you free from the old language of vanity, a word we don't use much today. And when we think of a vain person as someone who is pretty full of themselves and thinks they're the greatest and that they look so great, or they in some other ways. But in actual fact, what it means is, it is someone who does that when they don't have it. So it's meaningless, it's empty, it's an empty claim. Now, Ecclesiastes is going to open for us a set of questions, and the questions it will set are the sort of normal questions most people who are just thoughtful would look at the world after a while and say, I reckon this is pretty much the way things are, don't you? And if you read it through, you'd say, well, yes, it does. And so it begins with a set of observations, but they become much more acute and they become more disturbing. So there is a development, so it's helpful to read it through and get the development. Verse 3, what advantage does a man have in all his work which he does under the sun? That just means on the earth. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. Blowing towards the south, then turning towards the north, the wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. So the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. All things are wearisome. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has done is that which will be done. So there's nothing new under the sun. And is there anything of which one might say, see this, it's new. Already it's existed for ages, which were before us. There's no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. there'll be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. Now this opens so many questions at once. Your whole mind starts to whiz, doesn't it? But fundamentally, let's just try and list them. In asking what's the advantage of work, he will go, by work he doesn't just mean labour, but he does mean, he's not saying why would you work, he's saying people do work, but what's the advantage of that work? And someone might say, well, it earns us $1 and it feeds us. But here, this man is asking the question, what is the goal of your work? Not what is the payment for it. He's not valuing labour as a means to something else, but as a work to do something which is of itself worth doing. And so his view of work is actually a much more older and maturer view of work. He's bothered by generations and the way they come and go, and the earth seems to remain forever. In other words, it seems like men and women are they're fairly just here for a bit and then gone, but the earth seems to stay. And that raises a really important problem for him. If men and women, boys and girls, human beings, actually live and die, but the earth remains forever, well then surely you would think there is going to be very hard to find meaning in people who come and go and come and go. If you're a transitory person, you can hardly be permanent. So this raises an important question. Is permanency a decisive matter about mattering? Is it the important thing? If it is, no one does seem to survive. He says the sun rises and does its thing. The wind seems to go on a circular path as well. The rivers flow into the sea, but the sea's not full, and so to the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. Now, he's not trying to tell us, I think, how the weather cycle operates, and why he's not posing the question, why isn't the sea full? What he is saying, he's not telling us something scientific. He's just saying these are repetitive patterns, and these repetitive patterns don't cease. And when they don't cease, we're watching. How do you watch something that seems to be cyclic, that seems to be actually moving in a way that it doesn't have an ending and it doesn't have a beginning? Now, these are questions which the Eastern mysticism raises for us, doesn't it? And basic Buddhism understands that we live in cyclic time. And if you have cyclic time, one of the things that you start to lose is, does A come before B or B before A? So sequence becomes quite difficult to understand. And once you lose sequence, you lose cause-effect. You lose origin and result. You lose a lot of things which for us with a Judeo-Christian base, or this book has. So he's raising an important question in a Judeo-Christian book. He's actually saying, what do we make of the cyclic nature of the way the world keeps going? And of course it's from the point of view of a person upon the earth. The sun is seen to be rising and setting, not the earth revolving around the sun in some post-Copernican understanding. But what he's trying to get at is, what do you make of that? Doesn't that upset you that you come and go but this stuff stays the same? How do you deal with impermanence? And why would you bother to work? There's nothing you can do that's going to last more than you. Or even if it does, you won't benefit from it. Later you'll raise that question. So these are questions of cyclic nature of things, and they themselves, he says, they're wearisome. Further, he makes clear that everything that's existed, there's nothing new. In other words, if you pursue novelty for the fact that it's new, not another of the same, his whole point is it's always another of the same. So his understanding of new or novelty is there isn't anything new. It's all been before, and nothing will, in actual fact, ever be new in the Greek sense of neos, something which is like that. Now that raises an important set of questions already, because you start asking, is there another sense of new? which in actual fact is different to that, and there is. But for the moment, he's actually saying, this leads me to say it's all rather meaningless, all rather empty. So look, this is from the point of view of a person who's looking out from their own perspective, through their own eyes, and they're saying, from what I'm seeing, this whole stuff is cyclic and we don't last too long, you know, we're fairly impermanent people, so what's it all mean? So this is a question of meaning. I, the preacher, have been a king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under the heaven. It's a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I've seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind, that is, going after something which is you can never get hold of. That's quite. He doesn't mean wind in the sense of just breath and impermanence. What he means is you actually can't strive after the wind. You can't hold it. It's an unholdable commodity. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I've magnified and increased wisdom more than all who are over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. So his understanding is, I think I'm fairly wise. I think I've seen lots of things others haven't. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, and I realised that this is also a striving after wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. So his first chapter is actually saying, if you set out to say, well, it's not a matter of understanding these cyclic things, it's a matter of having wisdom in your life. And I don't know whether you've got the idea of wisdom, it's an important idea. A wise person knows what to do when. Whereas an intelligent person is clever, and a person who is full of knowledge has got lots of stuff in their head and can bring it, they have great factual knowledge, but wisdom is how on earth shall we live? When we're asking, how shall I live? We're actually saying, what's wise here? And later on he'll make clear that's a matter of timing and a question of context. And so he's now starting to tell you what he thinks wisdom is. So this is one of these strange books where he uses a word, wisdom, and then you think, oh, wonder what he means. And as he gets going, you begin to see what he means. So he's not using a word which you previously know how he uses it, but now on the way of his usage, you start to get it. Which tells us that, like it is often in many things, linguistic, usage is more important than derivation. It doesn't matter what the word is. It could be the word blick. As long as, if you just watch how we use the word blick, you'll soon know what we mean by blick. It's not a problem. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure, so enjoy yourself. So this is the Epicurean answer, if you will. This is the answer of pleasure. Behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, it's madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine, while my mind was guiding me wisely, how to take hold of folly until I could see what was good is there for the sons of men to do under heaven for the few years of their lives. In other words, let's just do foolish things. Let's just do empty stuff. Let's just potter around and we'll just play cards forever, and we'll just solve crossword puzzles, and we'll just do silly things or things that are not meaningful in themselves. And he says, I went for that. I went for the foolish thing and thought that's no good either. Now, my question is, I couldn't see what good there is for the sons of men to do in the few years of their lives. So this man is actually saying, is there anything good by the virtue of the doing of it? If something is pleasurable, whether it's to eat fine food, whether it's to enjoy an aesthetic and beautiful piece of art, or the beauty of a man or a woman, or the beauty of a scene, he says, in the end it brings you pleasure, but is that something which in actual fact is good? Is it a good thing to do? Will it be something that lasts? No, it doesn't. Pleasures don't last long. And he's going to go on to actually say, that doesn't seem wise. You can't do that for too long. You can't just go and look for beauty and nice things and pleasurable things to your eyes or to your taste or any of your senses. He says that's not going to help. And so he's already posing some important questions. What good is there for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives? I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks, and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. And I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves. I had home-born slaves, as I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. So what am I doing? I'm doing things. I'm acquiring. I'm building. I'm achieving. This has much to say to modern life. And he says, I'm doing all this. And I collected for myself silver and gold and treasure of kings and provinces, and I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. So he's got into sexual pleasure on a grand scale for Solomon. And his point is that I provided for myself. Now, all of these are about myself, verses 4 to 8. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. And all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labour, and this was my reward for all my labour. So it's a sense of satisfaction, sense that we've done well, we've built lots of things. And thus I considered all my activities with my hands had done, and the labour which I'd exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. So he's telling you that he had pleasure, but he doesn't say for a moment that this was in any sense something which would give meaning. So he's setting for us an important question, and in doing that, he's distinguishing things that differ. He's telling you pleasure is pleasure, satisfaction is satisfaction. I built lots of stuff, but he said, is that sufficient to give me meaning? So he's starting to raise the question, what is a human being for when it's all said and done? He comes to a very interesting answer to that. So I turned to consider wisdom, madness and folly. For what will a man do who will come after the king except what's already been done? So the question is, what are you going to do with your life? The answer is, well, it's already been done. Now this raises an important question for 21st century people such as ourselves. Are there very many people who are setting about to do stuff which has not already been done before? No, not much. And Solomon implies, if it's Solomon, the preacher or the teacher is implying no. Most people have done that sort of stuff before. They've built and had concubines and had lots of whatever. But his point is, yes, but what I want to know is, if it's about doing things, there's no satisfaction in just doing things. So he's now posing a question, what is the meaning for any man or woman's life? And it can't be in just doing stuff. It can't be just in activity or production or producing. He explains, I turned to consider wisdom, madness and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what's already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. He's about to explain why he thinks wisdom does excel foolishness. And you appreciate this is the great, I nearly said dualism. It's not quite a dualism. This is the great thing on the left and the right. Proverbs will tell you about the wise man is doing this, the fool does this. So a fool is not a jester. He's not a joker. He's a man without wisdom. And so when Proverbs and this text calls someone a fool, they don't mean silly or oddball or funny or lightweight. They don't mean that. They mean someone who's not wise. Someone who doesn't know what to do at the appropriate time is a fool. So he's actually now opening an important contrast for us. And this contrast, you've got to just accept his language and try for it. He thinks wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. So he can say that one is more excellent than the other, and your question must surely be, why? Why is wisdom more excellent than foolishness and light than darkness? Well, he'll take some time to tell you that. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness, and yet I know that one fate befalls them both. Now, this is one of his great conundrums of life, which is death. Death is a major leveller of all human beings because everybody dies. He doesn't deal with the question that death arises from sin. He simply notes all people do die. And if that's the case, if you lived well or as a fool, would you still end up dead? Well, yes. What is that about? Well, he explains. I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? And so I said to myself, this too is vanity. That is, from the point of view of not dying, wisdom does not help you, and folly doesn't change anything either. So this opens an important door. There are some things that wisdom and folly don't touch, and one of these is death. And he'll explain this as he keeps going. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. So now we're beginning to see why he thinks it is vanity. He's dealing with the question of death. And if death is coming to all men and women, what's the point of how you live or whether you did it different? Did you build or didn't you build? So the whole thing he's saying, in the light of death, can you actually assess your works, your wisdom, your folly? Aren't you going to get there in the end? Aren't they all going to die? If death does that, what's the point? Now that opens another important question. Does the meaning of something, is that fixed by the place or situation to which you arrive? Because he says everybody arrives at death. I can't see there's a difference. I don't see a difference in the arrival point no matter how you live. So this has a great power to it. It has this, the great power of the death issue is, well, why should I bother? Why would you want to be different if you end up dead anyway? If we're heading towards death, what's the point of that? And this helps us understand from this perspective, where there is no resurrection or no understanding of such a possibility, then these are very powerful questions. And these are the powerful questions that the existentialists of France in the late 1940s and 50s and 60s started to put. They said, if death is the end of everybody, well, what's the point? You just need to embrace death. And therefore, death becomes something which you need to fight. Think of Dylan and think of those who are actually sort of saying that you don't go softly into the night. You should fight to the end. It's Dylan Thomas, this is. And so in that respect, the understanding is that you need to fight it, but the point of the existentialist is why? Why not embrace it? Well, that leads to a concept of suicide for some reason of embracing it sooner than perhaps less, and that will take you out of suffering. So if you want to avoid suffering, then suicide's an obvious thing, and so the answer is it becomes an escapist thing. So there's a whole set of questions that death begins to raise. If it's all there is, death is a very powerful question. He explains, thus I hated all the fruit of my labour for which I'd laboured under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he'll be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labour for which I've laboured by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. It's hopeless. It's meaningless. There's no meaning in giving it to someone after me because that's not meaningful to me. He could just squander it. And therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labour for which I'd laboured under the sun. When there's a man who has laboured with wisdom, knowledge and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not laboured with them. this too is vanity and great evil. For what does a man get in all his labour and in his striving with which he labours under the sun? Because all his days in his task is painful and grievous, and even the nights in his mind doesn't rest. That too is vanity. And there's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labour is good. This is all I've seen, that it is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? For to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity and striving after wind. Now 24, 5 and 6 is a classic answer. And this is the first introduction of the view of God. Is there a God? Well, if there is, what's he doing with this? Well, he's saying everybody's labour is painful and grievous, and your mind doesn't rest at night either, for that matter. So there's no benefit from your labour for you. It might bring you some temporary satisfaction, verse 11, chapter 2, verse 11, but at the end, someone else takes the stewardship of it. So he says there's nothing better for a man to do. Notice he's not saying that this is meaningful. He's not saying this is the true answer, everyone. He's saying there's just nothing better that I know. And he said there's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labour is good. Tell me about that. If I tell myself my labour is good, then I'm the source of the origin of what goodness means. So I mean, it's good for me to do this. This seems good to me to do. Seems good to me to labour. I just enjoy it, or I get a kick out of it, or I like watching the buildings go up, or whatever. He says he should tell himself his labour's good. He doesn't know if it is. This also I've seen that it is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? So he starts to ask, wait a minute, if we did have enjoyment and it was pleasurable and it was stimulating and good, why is that something which has been given to us? So he's asking a fairly good question here. What he's saying is, you cannot eat for who can eat and who can have enjoyment without God? So now he's saying it's no reason to live to go for enjoyment and pleasure. But who can have pleasure in itself anyway if it's not from God? So he's now moved to some important questions. He's not saying there's meaning in having pleasure. No, he said there's not. I've already cancelled that in chapter 2, verses 1 to 6. He's saying if that's the case, it's not the pleasure that makes it meaningful. Yes, but where does pleasure come from? Well, that's God. He's caused us to be able to experience pleasure and to know that something's lovely in every way. And his question then is, you can eat then and have enjoyment, but you can't do that without God. For to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who's good in God's sight. So verse 26 puts forward a philosophy and a philosophical answer which says, my sense is, he says, that God, when he sees a person who's good in his sight, gives him joy and he gives him wisdom and knowledge and he has success, let's say, and but to sinners he gives them, he's given the task of gathering, collecting, so that he may give to one who's good. In other words, God pays back this way. He takes all the sinners' work and he makes it work for the good man. So this now means that we are now beginning to start to ask, if we're successful and we do lots of good things and lots of labour and have lots of enjoyment, is this because God has given us wisdom and knowledge and joy, while sinners, their work actually comes into our hands and we just take their work? Whereas previously he'd said, wait a minute, what if I die and my stuff goes into the hands of an idiot who never worked for it and just squanders it? Wouldn't that mean it's come into the hands of the not wise man? So you should be left asking, What's the relationship between wisdom and folly, good man and a sinner man? And aren't all men sinners anyway? Well, 'cause we would say, from our perspective, after Jesus Christ, they all die, you know. But that's just the question he's raising. So he's got an idea that there are good men and sinners, right? And he's going to try and hold that with the idea that everybody dies. That doesn't make sense. So he's grappling with an important problem. Are good men and women, are they good because of what they do, or are they good in the sight of God? Do they bring him pleasure? So 26 begins to open an important shift in the argument. Now he wants to bring in not the question of cyclic time, but the question of appropriateness of each moment. So he is talking very existentialist type language, very moment by moment language. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time for dancing, a time to throw stones, a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Now that is beginning to ask what wisdom is. Wisdom is doing the thing which is the appointed time to do it. Should we be laughing now? Well, no. We're in the middle of a deep funeral and we're missing Jim, who's just died. We're not cackling in crazy laughter. This is most untimely, and therefore it is not wise. It's in fact foolishness. In fact, it's rude in the whole set of things. In other words, the time to do things is what constitutes wisdom. Now, he's going to start to apply that. If you said to yourself, what's the presupposition behind that? What is the moment? What do you understand by a moment, a time? And the point is that something's happening. It's Twitter, isn't it? What's happening? In other words, it's actually a time which you'd say, what is happening right now? Well, we're sitting here talking, and this dude is talking. You say to yourself, what are we doing here? Well, we're reading a very beautiful but very peculiar book of scripture. And you say to yourself, is the wisdom literature quite different from Torah? Very. Different from history? Yes. Different from watching people start, as we've watched David and Solomon, start that their houses start to go into disarray because they actually start to reap things that they sow themselves. Is that also? But what is wisdom opening for us? It's actually saying, if you step back and you take a broad view, where's the meaning? And he's actually saying wisdom can't be disengaged. Wisdom is not something which you step back from and you take a wide purview of everything, and in doing that you say, oh, now I know how it all fits together and what it's all about. He says, no, wisdom is actually found in a moment. Yes, well, what's the moment about? Well, is it fitting? Are you doing what fits the moment? Is it a time to give birth? It seems so. The lady is about to give birth. Then this is a time to focus on that. What's wise? Well, we don't just leave her. We help her give birth, if you will. See, as he's actually saying, something is... So what's that raising? That's raising that if something is happening, how do you fit in with that? How do you actually take your place in the happening of the moment in a way that's wise and appropriate to what should be done, where should means should now, not morally should, but should now. See my difference? Wisdom is, we should do this now. And the answer is, who says? There's no rule, it's not a law, it's not a moral imperative. No, but it's a timely imperative. We should do this now. And you think, is that wisdom? Yes, it is. So now we start to ask, is morality and ethics a function of pre-thought, casuistry and case law, like if a man does this and this results, well then this is what it should happen now. That's a case, that's a presupposition, that's an imagined scenario which says if that happens, we do that. But wisdom says, no, the moment's to do this. We should do this right now. And so time and moral imperatives are now connected. And that's what we understand by wisdom. Wisdom is doing what's not right, but what is timely, which often turns out to be right, or wise. So wisdom is another category which includes space-time. That's the point. What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? That is, now this is not teaching essentially communistic or socialistic viewpoints, that the worker should be worthy of his toil. What he's saying is, what's the point for the worker? I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He's made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. In other words, God has put eternity into the heart of man. He's given him to know that there is something which is much, much bigger than him in terms of time. Now he's turning his whole observance around. He began by saying the cyclic nature of time makes us look zeros and little ants who aren't here for a time. Yeah? He says, well, now let me consider that again. Let me put you another scenario. The scenario is that in every man, his knowledge that he is not eternal, but there is an eternity, actually means that he needs to give his appropriateness to the particular time. Is this the time to do this? Well, that's what's appropriate to the eternal. We're starting to move into some deep water now. He's actually saying life is about doing what was your moment to do it in God's pattern. I know that there's nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labour. It's the gift of God. That is, if God gives it, he gives it, that you can see good in what you do. But he said, you can't see good in the doing. It's not enough just to do and say that's satisfying. The answer is, what's the point? He says, if you ask that about the labour, no point. If you ask it about what God has given you to do, now we're talking relational language. Now we're saying, is my work important because God considers my work as important and this is my time to do it? Well, now he's saying, this is beginning to tell you where the answer's beginning to lie. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There's nothing to add to it and there's nothing to take away from it. This is Jesus teaching. At the end of the day, we are unprofitable servants. We can add nothing to God nor take away from him. Notice that Solomon already got that. For God has so worked that men should fear him. That which is has been already, and that which will be has already been. For God seeks what has passed by. Tell me about that. Is he saying God is not a novelty person? He just doesn't like doing new stuff. Now, God can do a new thing, as Isaiah will say, but that doesn't mean new as in oddball new. It means new, meaning something that you could do that would be new to us, that would renovate our situation. So the important question to ask here is that God seeks for what has passed by. What do you make of that? It's very important, I think. It's in the context of that which is has been already from our perspective. and that which will be has already been, from our perspective, for God seeks what has passed by. That is, does God allow past things to repeat? Yes, he does. And Solomon thinks that means he seeks what's passed by. He seems to come back to it. Well, doesn't this bore God? Is God bored by the fact that things repeat? Or is there something to this repetition which is actually significant for an eternal personage? We have to sit and wait. Furthermore, I have seen under the sun that in the place of justice there is wickedness, in the place of righteousness there's wickedness. I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there. So judgment of righteousness and wickedness is a matter of timing as far as God is concerned. So now we've shifted from a moral imperative. God says, I like this, you should do it. Keep my Sabbaths. Right? Now we're at a place where God is saying, you did what was appropriate, what was important to do. You met your moment and you had wisdom for your moment. I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. God has tested them that they may come to a place and see how poor they are as to their humanity. They're just like beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there's no advantage for man over beast. All is vanity. All go to the same place. All come from the same dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows that what the breath of man ascends upwards and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? How do you know that? Does an animal fare better than you? Do you fare better than an animal? Does one go up and one go down? Who knows that? And I have seen that nothing is better than that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? So he's now dealing with another conundrum, which is, after death, you haven't got a clue. Has anybody been able to tell you that a beast goes down and a man goes up? No. Are humans better than beasts? They all die. So what do you mean better? So the betterness can't be as to the fate or as to their end. Now what Solomon is teaching us is, if you try and discern the end from the perspective of men and women upon the earth, you come to these amazing conundrums. That death even occurs to the dog in the gutter as it does to the man or woman. And his issue is, if that's the case, well then, how do you know they're better? Better in what sense? Better as to an outcome? He says, no, same outcome. Now this sounds very despairing, but actually he's raising an important question. How would you know where value lies in the light of these things? These are very important questions for modern evolutionists. The question is, survival of a species is somehow considered to be an important thing. Whereas in actual fact, the whole basis of their evolutionary code is that species that don't survive are in fact they are in fact an evidence that others in their survival are surviving because they're adapting to what is the time, what is the moment. Is the earth cold? Is it warm? There's a whole set of questions there. Now he's saying no answers go there. There's no answers there. He said a man falls over as much as a rhino does, and they both fossilise. His whole point is no. So now, having posed that, he now asks this question. I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun, and I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them. So I congratulated the dead, who were already dead, more than the living, who are still living. But better off than both of them is one who's never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. Now that is an important problem. Can you see what he's getting at? What he's saying is this. It's an oppressive world, and the powerful just have the power, and the oppressed never have anyone to comfort them. So I congratulated the dead. I said, thank God you're dead, because you're not living where the living are, who are having an oppression come to them. And better off than someone who never existed either, because they haven't seen either the suffering or the dying. Tell me what this is a way of reasoning which is very important. This is the issue that if there is suffering in the world, it is better not to suffer, then it's better to be dead, because you've stopped suffering, and if you've never existed, you haven't got either, suffering or death. So 1, 2 and 3 of chapter 4, 1 to 3, is actually raising the question of the great power of oppression and suffering. If life is difficult, then he congratulates the dead because they've passed through it and they've done it, and they're not suffering right now. Who says they're not? He says from the point of view of us who are living on the earth, they're not, because they're dead. Aren't they? Yes, they are. But are they suffering? Well, we don't know about that. All we know is we are. So this is a perspective of suffering from the existential moment of the person who is on the earth and is saying, from my perspective, the dead are better off and those who didn't exist are better off, because I hate the suffering and the oppression. So this is about escape. This is about stopping being oppressed and suffering. And I have seen that every labour and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between man and his neighbour. This too is vanity and striving after wind. Why do people get good? Because they want to do better than the next man. His question is now, see, he's raising very, very modern questions, but what we're really saying is modern questions are simply the same questions that turn up. There's nothing new under the sun. The fool, I missed a text. He says, this too is vanity and striving after wind. The fool holds his hands and consumes his own flesh. One hand full of rest is better than 2 fists full of labour and striving after wind. Then I looked again at vanity under the sun. There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there's no end to all his labour. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom am I labouring and depriving myself of pleasure? This too is vanity, and is a grievous task. So this is the lack of having someone as your dependent, someone that you care for. If you've got no one to care for, you will lose value. Something profoundly being stated here, because his whole point is the reason for work in his view is, don't think for a moment he is announcing conclusions philosophically. He's simply saying, I'm looking at oppression and I'm saying, seems to me the dead are better off and those didn't exist. But he rolls right onto a new scenario and the competition between skilled people. He said, isn't that sad? And then he rolls on and says, and yet there are people who've got no one to work for. Oh, that's sad too, because they don't have any reason, which would imply the reason to work is for others. He's now beginning to bring out his presuppositions. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labour, meaning they're more efficient. But if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who falls when there's not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if 2 lie down together, they keep warm. But how can you be warm alone? If 1 can overpower him who is alone, 2 can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. So this is a picture of there is great help in human exchange and care for each other and working together and sharing life together. A poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction.
Going back to cord of 3 strands, that's often used as symbolic of marriage.
Yeah.
Covenant of marriage.
Yes, it is.
But that, the third, is referring to God as the thing that holds it together.
In a Trinitarian sense, do you mean?
Yeah.
To do that, we need to read it in from the New Testament.
Is it?
Yeah, I'm staying with what he's saying first. I'm not saying it can't be done, but you'll then be handling the text in the light of a further revelation which this man doesn't have. He seems to be saying, as two can share and help each other and be warm and share their labour, and so three.
There's a third cord there.
Well, I think he's just saying that.
Third strand.
Yeah, a cord of that's not single.
He's only referring to two. Two can defend themselves.
Yes, he is, with reference to people, but his image moves to an impersonal thing, like which is a rope, and he's saying, because no one makes a twofold rope, so three as a plait, and because of the reverse twist, and so he's actually saying that in the same way that a threefold cord is stronger than a single strand, so two people are stronger than a single, in that sense. I guess it's going down that road, Graham. Notice that a poor yet wise lad, where the contrast is poverty and lad, is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. Presumably a lad does, because he's young. For he has come out of the prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I've seen all the living under the sun throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. There is no end to all people. There's no end to all people, to all who are before them, and even the ones who will come later will not be happy with him, for this too is vanity, striving after wind. In other words, he's saying that when people find someone who is really a ruler, the person who replaces him, they'll just automatically put their trust and they'll put their affections onto the new man who replaces him, because it's in being who he is as to king that the people just flock there. He says people just transfer allegiances and they'll be happy with him because he's the king after all. What can you do? Chapter 5. You should guard your steps as you go to the house of God, and draw near to listen, rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they're doing evil. Do not be hasty in word or impulsive in thought to bring up a matter in the presence of God. For God is in heaven, and you're on the earth, and therefore you should let your words be few. So what he's saying is about approaching God as a man who is got not too much weight, really, a bit of a lightweight thing is men and women. About approaching God, better to listen than to think you'll presume to offer some sacrifice that you think God will like. And do not be hasty with or impulsive in thought. Bring up a matter in the presence of God, because he's in heaven and you're on the earth. And so your words should be few, meaning there's a great difference between heaven and earth, and you're in a place where these oppressions and weaknesses and vanities and this seemingly meaningless life is, when in fact God's life's not like that. For the dream comes through much effort, and the voice of a fool through many words. I'm not sure that I understand verse 3 or the picture, but I suspect he's saying something like the dream, which is the communication from God, as I think the ancients would have understood a dream, comes through much effort. That is, approaching God carefully, understanding who you're dealing with, and the voice of a fool is through many words. So I think verse 3 explains that verse 2d, let your words be few. When you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it. He takes no delight in fools. Pay what you owe, what you vow. It's better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Do not let your speech cause you to sin, and do not say in the presence of the messenger of God that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry on account of your voice and destroy the work of your hands? His whole point is you've got to watch your mouth with God, and don't let your speech cause you to sin. And don't say things in the presence of the angels of God that was a mistake. For in many dreams and in many words there is emptiness. Rather, fear God That is, have a right stance towards God, that he's in heaven, you're on the earth. Don't be too smart. Better to listen, shut your mouth, and actually not vow too much or not at all, and don't let your speech get you into trouble with God. Just fear him, in the sense of revere him, I think. If you see oppression of the poor and denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight, for one official watches over another official, and there are high officials over them. After all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. You might think, what is all this about? Well, you just try and understand his first picture is, if you see people oppressed and poor and a denial of justice, you don't necessarily have to intervene. You shouldn't be shocked about that, because there are people who are accountable. And if they're not, someone's watching over them. So there is a chain of command here, and if people are doing wrong, someone will hold them to account, meaning you don't have to. And you shouldn't be shocked either, because these things happen. You shouldn't be shocked at the sight, I mean. That's have to say, that's a funny thing. No, that happens, he says, but people are called to account. And after all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. In other words, what he's actually saying is, people have thought that a king, but as we've already seen in Solomon, and certainly in the writings of David, and certainly in the writings of Samuel, is that kings are going to be costly because they're going to take up your land and they're going to rob you of your land. He's saying, no, a king who actually uses land is an advantage to the land. He's getting some return. He's not letting it lie fallow. So in other words, if a king cultivates the field, that's an advantage to the land. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. So these are things. You can't have satisfaction ever in things. When good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what's the advantage of their owners except to look on? In other words, when there's more, then the consumers are more. Either because the same number of people consume more, or the increase can now go to more people. It could be an increase in the consumer market, or it could be that the market is richer. It doesn't matter which, he says, because the point simply is that what's the advantage to their owners except to look on? The sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep. So in other words, a man who's working hard falls asleep because he's tired, even though he's hungry. But a man with a full stomach, who doesn't, implication of the rich man who doesn't work, doesn't allow him to sleep. There is a grievous evil which I've seen under the sun, riches being hoarded by their owner to his hurt. Isn't that an amazing statement? That what he's saying is, when people start to hoard their wealth, it actually starts to go backwards. It starts to harm them. And he says that when those riches were lost through a bad investment and he had fathered a son, then there was nothing to support him. As he'd come naked from his mother's womb, so will he return as he came. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labour that he can carry in his hand. There is nothing you can carry in your hand out of this world. Meaning, things are not transferable to another life and to another set of relations. So what he's saying about death is, it's the end of the usefulness of things. Because when you die, someone else becomes a steward of yours. And in fact, it wasn't yours. You were just a steward of it in the first place. And you were the steward of someone else's stuff. So all we have in this life is stewardship, never ownership. So he's understanding that ownership is not something which is in any sense useful. All you do is steward what you've got, and you go out stark naked with nothing. This also is a grievous evil. Exactly as a man is born, thus will he die. So what's the advantage to him who toils for the wind? So he's saying, now notice he's not saying something despairing or something pessimistic. What he's saying is, then it can't be true, can it, that things are going to go on eternally? If that's the case, if you come into the house naked and you go out the same, and you can't take your stuff with you, well then, for goodness sake, work out that things are not something which are permanent, and go on. Throughout his life, he also eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness and anger. See, what he's actually saying is, if you thought your things were permanent, that would even rob you of the life, of the fun of doing it. It'll just be a vexation and sickness and anger. So people who are in the bind of saying getting stuff and accruing wealth is in fact a thing worthwhile in life because it's the meaning of life, he's saying that in itself is a deep mistake which actually robs them of the excitement of even doing the thing. It's a circular self-return. So he actually says, here is what I've seen to be good and fitting. Notice the words good and fitting. Fitting goes back to the time issue. To eat, to drink and enjoy oneself in all one's labour in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him. For this is his reward, meaning enjoyment, and to appreciate and just enjoy the labour and the time under the sun which God has given. If you enjoy it as God has given, that is the reward. In other words, the meaning of your labour and your toil and everything you do under the sun is that if you're going to have a reward in it, you'll have to regard it as a gift of God, and you'll have to regard it as something to be enjoyed because he gave it. The meaning of your toil is he gave it, and it's to be enjoyed because he did give it. It's an enjoyment derived and has its origin in God's gift of the thing itself. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and receive his reward and rejoice in his labour. This is a gift of God, for he will not often consider the years of his life because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart. So here's a person who enjoys life as a great gift of God. They just rejoice in their labour as a thing God has given, and that in itself means they don't worry about how long they're living or what's the meaning. They have gladness of heart. So what's he actually now telling us? The meaning of your work is not in itself. The meaning of things is not in themselves, and they only last for your naked coming in and your naked going out. There's nothing else to go. And his whole point then is you'll have to regard these things as God's gift. So you have to start thinking relationally. You have to start saying, oh, this is a really interesting job I've got. God has given me this. And I'm enjoying this labour. God has given me this moment to enjoy. And this enjoyment is in fact the reward of the labour. So in other words, the labour has its meaning in enjoying a gift that God has given. That is your time on the earth, and that's your appropriate moment. So what God has given each of us is this moment. This is where we are, and this is the time to enjoy it. And so what Solomon is now saying is, see what he's already done now. He started to rip away from us. He's starting to say, if it's all about labour, life's meaningless. If it's all about stuff, life's meaningless. That's all vanity. It's a waste of time. If it's all about people dying, if you just consider death, that makes all of it meaningless. Let me tell you that. Is it talking about being a wisdom or a fool? No, they both go to the same place. So death robs you of the answers of life. If you focus on death and think that's where we're all going to end up, it will rob you of the meaning of your present life. But if you regard the gift that God has given you as a matter of timing, then you will begin to start to enjoy even the work because it's a gift of God. You've thought of it relationally as coming from him as something which is his gift to you. And that means you'll probably be a very timely person, meaning you'll be wise and you'll know what to do when. Because if your job and your work is a gift of God, well then you enjoy the work. And in enjoying the work, you actually know what's appropriate. So if you're building the chair and the joint breaks, then you have the wisdom to say, we are not going to glue this up. We're chucking it away and starting again with another piece of wood. That's timely. That's wisdom. Wisdom doesn't try and do that. So he's saying, even in your labour, if you want to be wise, it's a gift of God that you've been receiving. So this is the beginning of where we're going. Now our time's gone. It's appalling how an hour runs away with us, but it's important to see that in this time then, by the end of chapter 5, he's starting to tell you a little clue. It's about relation. It's about caring for people. It's about having joy in labouring for someone else. So in other words, he's starting to see that the meaning of your work is not what it means to you, except and insofar as what it means to you as a gift of God. That's an issue of grace. But for a dependent, it's a matter of working so that others can have the benefit of your labour. And that's the joy of it. So by the end of chapter 5, he's beginning to start to tell us there's no answers if you're just a death watcher. But there are answers to be found in the moment. Yeah, what are they? Well, they have to do with God giving you certain opportunities. They have to do with being wise to knowing about the time. And here, he's now begun to ask the question, it's good and fitting to eat, drink and enjoy yourself in all one's labour during the few years of life God has given him. For this is his reward. So if you enjoy life and enjoy your labour and enjoy the fruit of it, this is a reward and it's a gift of God in itself. Got any questions about where this is going? If you read through 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12, you'll start to see that he's going to develop this. My concern is that we actually start to understand how to use wisdom literature. It's a profound way of raising awkward questions, but awkward because once you raise the questions and you close off an answer, that's not a matter of despair, that's a matter of saying, that's a cul-de-sac. There's no answers down that road. We'll have to look somewhere else for answers to this question. And so he's now teaching you what questions to ask, which is the whole centre of theology and the whole centre of life. The business of life is not to find answers, it's to find the right questions. Then the answers flow. I once had the pleasure of working with an evangelist in this country on the other side of Australia, and he did a series called "If Jesus is the Answer, What Are the Questions?" And so he did his evangelism by saying, these are the questions, and now you know how Jesus is the answer. But his whole point was, it's no point in telling people Jesus is the answer until you say, to what question? And that's what Solomon is teaching us. He's saying, let me put you questions. Oh, no answers there. And he just keeps cutting off until you say, well, wait on, how can you live then? What's the point? And he's saying, glad you got that now. Let's try and see that. Now, Father, we worship you that you've made us to be upon the earth. And we worship you that you've made us to know you and to know that you are the person who gives us what it is to be good and fitting in this world. We also praise you that you are a God of great kindness to us and allow us to have good and sufficient rewards even in the doing of that which you have set us. And we begin to understand that work is in fact doing what God has set us to do. That work is what the oldies would have called vocation, calling. It's a place of arriving to do what God has put in our heart to do. We want to praise you for that. We want to ask that you would give us a deep sense of satisfaction in what we do, because we understand that it is your gift in the short time we have upon the earth to be about the business which you have set us. And we praise you for that. And we look to you as the great overseer of our life, the person who has set us and brought us to this time, and that we are born and made in this time. This is our moment. This is our period on the earth. And we need to know what it is that you've given us to do. Teach us, we say, in Jesus' name. Amen.